Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Bradley Rettler. Now, Bradley did an episode with Mark about a year and a half ago covering the basics of Bitcoin and all of it's called the FAQ episode in terms of Bitcoin, which I would still encourage folks to listen to that episode if you want to get more into what is Bitcoin and a lot of common questions asked. This episode, we focused a little bit more on progressive politics, on his upcoming book that he has coming out with Andrew and Craig from Resistance Money, called Resistance Money, actually, which will be hopefully published in early 2024, which we'll keep you all posted on. But anyway, Bradley is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Wyoming and likes to talk all things progressive politics, Bitcoin, philosophy, and everything in between. So we get into a lot of that in this conversation and really hope you all will enjoy this episode. And as always, you can give me any feedback on the episode. You can reach me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. All right, I'll let you get to the episode and we'll see you again next week. Hey, Bradley, welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner. Welcome back to the Progressive Bitcoiner, I should say.
Thank you very much. Good to be back.
Yeah, excited to have you on. And for those, I'll mention this again, for those that have not listened, Bradley recorded an episode with previous host Mark Stefani about a year and a half ago, covering the basics of Bitcoin, just a deep dive into what is Bitcoin. I would highly encourage you to look into that episode as well. This one, we're going to take a bit of a different approach with the conversation, but folks can check that out for all of that content, which is an awesome episode. But before we jump in, Brad, do you want to tell people a little bit about who you are that may not know, what you do and what you've been doing in the space?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. My name is Bradley Rettler. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Wyoming. And having first been exposed to and started thinking about Bitcoin in late 2013, early 2014, I started thinking of it as a research interest for my job in 2017, 2018. And along with Craig Warmke and Andrew Bailey, started a Bitcoin research collective approaching questions about Bitcoin from a philosophical standpoint. And we've written some papers on cryptocurrency and now are writing a book on Bitcoin.
Awesome. And super excited for the book. The book is Resistant Money. That's right. That's going to be the title of the book.
Resistance Money. Although we did go back and forth, Resistant Money or Resistance Money.
Resistance. Yes. Yeah. It is both. Super excited. We've had a lot of really great Bitcoin books coming out, and I'm super excited for this one to come out. But why don't we start there with this book? How did that come about? Because I know you all have been working on articles and had been appearing on podcasts talking about a lot of these things. So can you tell people a little bit about how did that start in terms of like, wow, we want to write a book on this, actually kind of collect all of these thoughts, all these articles? And how did you narrow down what to talk about in the books? Because people can reference the website. I believe all your chapter markers are probably still the same as what will be in the final publish. Is that right?
Not quite. But yeah, resistance.money/book gives you chapter summaries of maybe a paragraph each. And some of those will be moved around where we combine some chapters, and the security and energy chapter will be 2 chapters instead. So, but it'll all be pretty close. The slightly long story is that Andrew and I had been talking about Bitcoin for a while. And then I went to a conference that Craig was giving a paper at, and his paper was on Bitcoin. And Craig and I had known each other from several years back, but had never talked about Bitcoin at all. And so after his talk, or maybe before his talk, we met up and I said, I can't believe you're thinking about Bitcoin. And Craig is like, are you into Bitcoin? And so we talked about Bitcoin. And then at the party at the end of the conference, Craig and I were like off in our own little corner, and some people would come and go, but he and I basically just stayed in one spot for 3 or 4 hours talking about Bitcoin, and started up a Gmail chat with Andrew, just thinking about philosophical implications and philosophical takes on Bitcoin. And we decided we wanted to try to write something about it. And there's, a lot of stuff about Bitcoin is best handled by computer scientists or lawyers or macroeconomists or whatever. And so the topics of the book are kind of constrained by what we're good at, which is we're good at doing philosophy. And so we can think about moral concerns regarding privacy and censorship and inclusion and things like that, because we took a lot of ethics classes, and that's kind of how we think. So obviously there are philosophical ramifications for some of the other things, like the computer science, like the monetary policy. And so we do talk about those, but we try to keep our own arguments and conclusions squarely in the space that's licensed to us by our training in philosophy. We don't talk too much about like macroeconomic predictions or things like that, because that's just not what we know.
Wow, Bitcoiners staying in their lane. That's an interesting concept as well. No, that's great, and yeah, I'm really excited for this book to come out. For folks that say, how does Bitcoin connect with philosophy, with morality? What would be your pitch to those folks? Because I think a lot of people that are in it can see that connection, but what our hope is that more and more of the audience that listens to this and finds value in these episodes and content might be progressives, left, mainstream, or people that don't even know that much about Bitcoin or understanding, why are we approaching it in this lens of, equity, equality, philosophy, morality, all of these things. So, what would you say to those folks about that?
Yeah, the first thing that Andrew and Craig and I ever wrote together, the first thing that we published, at least, maybe we had started writing some stuff, but the first thing that we published was a CoinDesk article called "Why Bitcoin Needs Philosophy." So I would
Hmm.
say, look at that. But the basic
Yep.
idea is that um, Bitcoin is relevant to a very large group of disciplines. Um, the ones we've already mentioned: computer science, law, economics, um, also psychology, sociology, things like that. So you can approach them from one of these angles and talk a lot about the computer science of Bitcoin, but that won't necessarily draw out the economic implications of that computer science or the moral
Hmm.
implications of that computer science. And philosophy is kind of uniquely situated to take on all of these. In philosophy, we can take anything from any discipline as premises in an argument. And sometimes they're empirical, sometimes they're a priori. They're just theoretical from first principles. And we can mix the two kinds of things. You can have an economic premise plus a moral premise that yields either an economic or a moral premise. So philosophy has this unique standing, I think, in the academy, in that it takes as inputs everything. And so, we're far from the best computer scientists or economists or lawyers. We're far from the best philosophers, but we do have this ability to navigate all these kinds of spaces, and then hopefully, stay in our lane with respect to speculation about other disciplines, and try to let the arguments sort of take us where they will.
Mm. And in terms of academia, I know the short answer on this, but how do you feel Bitcoin reception has been? Let's say in philosophy in general. So you said, okay, we're not even the best philosophers or this and that, but you are a few, and I think you're
Mhm.
incredible philosophers. You are a small few that navigate this world and all of these intersections, and not many are. I think that number will grow quite a bit as we continue to go on, as people know or may not know. Bitcoin's only 14 years old. So I like to think it's probably going to be here for a while in terms of people talking about it, researching it. But in terms of academia, since you said 2017ish, things like that, up to today, how have you seen Bitcoin grow or evolve in terms of real academic research and study, or has it just not?
I think in economics, it's been going on for a while and continues to grow. Will Luther was publishing on Bitcoin in 2011. So
Mhm.
way, way before I was even thinking about it as a potential subject of study. Computer science, similar. There's been stuff for a long time. Within philosophy, it's been starting to grow. I believe that Craig's paper was "What is Bitcoin?" published in Inquiry, was one of the first. Um, and then there's Asya Pasinski has a paper on it. Martin Glaser
Mhm.
has a paper on it. Andrew and Craig and I have a series of papers on cryptocurrency more generally. We pitched Bitcoin. They countered with blockchain. We met in the middle with cryptocurrency.
With crypto.
So I think interest is growing in terms of the actual published work. In terms of like what the academy thinks of it, people who aren't working on it, it's very mixed. Some people think it's really cool to use our training to investigate this new phenomenon. And there's been sort of a move in philosophy towards kind of applied social issues in the last 5 or 6 years that we're well situated in. So rather than just doing these pure investigations into being and time and space and things like that, people are turning their attention towards phenomena that we experience in the world and thinking, what we've learned about metaphysics or ethics teach us about these things: gender, race, sexual orientation, love, humility, forgiveness, basically anything. And so money is one of those things, and Bitcoin is an example of a money. So I think most people are intrigued and they think it's cool and they want to, know what we come up with. Some people have a mistaken understanding of the origins of Bitcoin and the implications of Bitcoin. They think it's this right-wing or libertarian kind of thing. They've maybe read some people that have erroneously claimed that and just never really done that much research themselves about it. And so they're kind of dismissive of the project and hostile towards the idea of doing it, of lending Bitcoin any legitimacy. And, they don't, of course, listen to these kinds of conversations that we're about to have about progressivism and Bitcoin and how Bitcoin fulfills progressive ideals because they don't care enough to do it. And they've kind of decided what they're going to believe about it.
Yeah. And, so much of that, it's a whole other conversation, but just a point of privilege, their own, status in the world, their own positioning and their, job, their, academic setting, their business setting, whatever. So that makes a lot of sense.
They're not interested in stories about how people in developing countries are using Bitcoin, how protest movements are using Bitcoin. Not necessarily because were they presented with it, they wouldn't believe it, but they're so confident already in their own stance that they just think it would be a waste of time to actually listen to any good things about Bitcoin. And I can understand that. I have that view about various things, right? There's all these mummies coming up everywhere that might be alien mummies. And I've got friends that are like, you've got to do a deep dive into this stuff. And I'm like, I'm confident enough that they're fake that I'm not going to do a deep dive into that right now. Yeah. And, if a lot more evidence comes out, maybe I'll look at it later. So maybe that's the position that they're in with Bitcoin. I can't necessarily fault them for that.
Yeah. And that's a generous take in that, for I think many folks, like when I first heard about Bitcoin, I was like, oh, that like crypto bros, that like, what is this thing? And then you have to do some counterintuitive mental gymnastics to get to a point where I'm like, I think this could be one of the most important things for our world in terms of all of these things we'd like to see be different. That's quite a stretch of road to get between. And I think, encourage people and Bitcoin educators and things like that to keep practicing patience and actually talking to people about what this is rather than just saying also outlandish claims like, right, Bitcoin fixes everything. If you don't understand it, I don't have time, right? Those kind of mantras aren't going to really get us anywhere with that. But as you alluded to, you talk a lot about progressive politics, being a progressivism, and Bitcoin. And in terms of Bitcoin media landscape, a lot of the people that are some of the loudest proponents of Bitcoin, I would argue, are more on the right and US libertarian leaning stage in terms of our US context. And obviously there's so many global stories of Bitcoin that we like to highlight as well. But for this conversation and for those listening, I'm going to focus a lot on the US context in terms of progressives. So in terms of you being a progressive, if you don't mind me asking, where did that start for you? Kind of your political journey? Is it a lot of people are like, okay, I kind of found more of my political values and leanings in college or through this or that, or I was really excited about this movement that I was a part of. Where did that start for you?
It started with Bernie Sanders in the lead up to the 2016 primaries and election. And I think prior to that, I probably would have described myself as sort of leaning libertarian. And then when I heard Bernie start talking about, taking care of other people and lifting up the people at the bottom, and if that involves necessarily bringing down the people at the top a little bit, that should be a sacrifice that we're willing to make. And I sort of looked back on the things that I had believed previously and thought that I was really selfish and not a very good person, and that my motivations were suspect. And I liked his vision for kind of community and what we owe to each other as a country, as a group of people, and the kinds of sacrifices that we should be willing to make for each other. So I think that sort of jolted me out of whatever mildly libertarian, but mostly not caring that much about politics at all state of mind that I was in.
Mm. And I don't think it's just random or coincidence that a lot of Bitcoiners that would say they're progressive or on the left before Bitcoin were Bernie bros, were in the Bernie camp, were from that political leaning. And for me, coming from that camp as well, there was such a natural connection. It didn't take me to, a couple of months, but early on, I started to realize the potential of looking to upend a system that benefited the 1%, looking to upend a system that did not support workers' rights, and that kept this inequality raging, and inflation raging and all these things. There was a natural connect for me. So I don't think it's any coincidence. There are a lot of folks that are from the Bernie camp or more progressive camp in the US that once they get into Bitcoin and figure it out, there's a natural connection there. I think that makes a ton of sense. But for people that aren't from that political camp, I think they're very confused about that, because for many folks, progressive, or that word, means much of what they've seen in terms of like large government deficits, problems, and political problems just continue to go on, and the Democrats don't do anything about it. Right? That's what a lot of people associate with that word. So something that I battle with very openly and honestly, whether it's stuff I post or just in private chats, is even the name of this podcast in general, and the weight of that word, which I really enjoy, but I'm able to get through some of this stuff that people are distracted by. And I suppose you could say that about any name of anything. Being a philosopher, I'm sure we could talk for 12 hours about that. But for you, that word, that association, do you see where people are coming from with that? Do you think a lot of that is just people not liking your values and politics in general, or mine, or whoever from the left? How do you sort through all that in terms of folks that are from the left navigating in the Bitcoin community, navigating with the word progressive, things like that?
Yeah, I think you can think of progressivism in a bunch of different ways. So there's this historical take on it that traces back to the 1920s and government regulations about businesses and breaking up of monopolies and things like that, and goes back even further to like the creation of a free market, or the attempt to get rid of limitations of people that are trying to participate in the market. So you could see progressives as like fighting against serfdom and things like that. You could think of it as a set of values that is maybe some sort of cluster. And if you accept enough of them, then you're a progressive. Or you could think of it as a set of policies that you want the government to enact. And the way that I think about it is the middle one, the set of values. So I think of the people who consider themselves progressive, and this just might be a semantic issue about how people today use the term progressive. But when I think of a progressive, I think of someone who thinks that healthcare is a right that people should have, that people shouldn't be dying because they can't afford insulin, or they can't afford a surgery that they would need. I think of being anti-war, thinking that the U.S. should not have, gone into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that. Believing in equal rights, being against monopolies, thinking that climate change is real and is partly caused by humans, and that we could do something to slow it down or stop it. Getting more people the right to vote and the ability to vote. Reforming immigration, letting more people in, things like that. So I think, if you agree with most of these or all of these, then I would consider you a progressive. Then there's a bunch of policies that various official organizations that have the term progressive in their name advocate for in order to bring about these values. And I think you could disagree with all of those and still be considered a progressive. Maybe you have more nuanced takes and you don't think, for example, that the Green New Deal or Medicare for All is the right way of bringing about climate change mitigation and economic inequality and healthcare, people dying because they can't afford healthcare. So I think, you probably still count as a progressive, but maybe some of those organizations wouldn't consider you a progressive. And so I don't know how much to fight for or about the term, but when I use it, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah. And I just happen to agree with you. I think I've mentioned that multiple times where for me, progressive is about a value set. A lot of my friends who would call themselves progressives is about a value set. And it's not about a political party. And I would argue that's our approach here through the Progressive Bitcoiner as well. Like I'm one person. I'm going to have guests on that are progressive and not. And it's kind of about these conversations that center around different value sets and different things to talk about. This isn't the progressive perspective on Bitcoin or the world, and this is the one take, just like Jason Meyer says in his book. It's like it's a progressives. Like I'm a progressive Bitcoiner podcast. So I think folks listening in the Bitcoin space, I think a lot of prominent Bitcoiners in the space that also align with left or progressive, when they say that, most people I've had conversations with typically are in that camp of it's a value set. We're not advocating for one specific policy, or we might disagree on policies or things like that. Just at a personal level, we're not advocating for like one political party or a political leader. It's this value set. And I think when in terms of just the Bitcoin community, when Bitcoiners can come into the space understanding that, I think we're able to have better conversations rather than hearing, oh, you're progressive. That means you want the Green New Deal and that's it. Well, no, that doesn't necessarily, maybe not, but that's not the starting point. So I think that's a very good distinction that hopefully many people will hear loud and clear. So I don't have to keep repeating that to folks in the community. But
I think just like any other fandom or group of people, if you get a bunch of people who are enthusiastic about guitars or about a certain video game or something, there's going to be a wide range of views represented. There are certainly Bitcoiners who don't count as progressive. There are Bitcoiners, for example, who think that women shouldn't have jobs and should stay at home all the time. I don't think they share the same value system. I don't think if we abstract up enough, we can say, oh yeah, we agree about this, so I would count you as a progressive too. There are certainly people who are disconnected. But someone who thinks that, say, it's important to have racial equality or gender equality, but they disagree about the very specific measures. They disagree about particular bills, something like that. I'm not sure that disqualifies you from being a progressive. So I think of it as a pretty wide camp.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, and I think one thing for folks to know as well, and for us to jump into, the whole reason of having a lot of these conversations too, is also because there have been so many folks in the progressive and left camp that have been, for not trying to make it sound like a conspiracy the way they want, but have been lied to about Bitcoin or lied to about certain things in terms of the way our world works or Fed policy or different things that they just don't think about, right? So a lot of these conversations are intended for those folks as well to say, we're not trying to say Bitcoin is progressive in this way. Bitcoin's a progressive tool. There are ways you can assign progressive values and say this is how it helps fulfill that, or this works in conjunction with that. But it's also because there's so much FUD from the left still about Bitcoin that we're trying to say, no, it is not owned by this political camp or this political party. It is a free and open tool for accomplishing a lot of different things, which could include some of these progressive values that we talk about. And are you optimistic? Not that this necessarily matters in Bitcoin's journey, I think, but are you optimistic that some, let's say, some political leaders or some progressive political leaders, whether it's AOC, Bernie Sanders, do you think there's going to be a light bulb moment at some point? Just for fun, do you think this would actually happen where they're like, oh, I'm actually connecting that my residents who are having a tough time getting bank accounts or have been, disproportionately affected by terrible loan practices and things like this can actually benefit from a tool that's built around Bitcoin. It doesn't mean Bitcoin's going to solve all their problems, but just seeing the problems that exist. Do you think there could be a light bulb moment anytime soon for these leaders? Because some days I wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's any day now. They're going to connect the dots and see, regardless of Bitcoin, they're going to see, oh, the way we've been going, these band-aid solutions aren't going to work if our global financial system continues the way it is. That's kind of the light bulb thing that I'm thinking. And then through that, they might see, okay, Bitcoin offers some better checks on certain things. And, we could talk about the varying degrees of that. But where are you in terms of thinking about actual political leaders from the left really beginning to understand some of these things?
I know some of them have had the light bulb moment because
Yeah.
I've talked to some of them who have said that they had the light bulb moment. I suspect some of them have had the light bulb moment, but haven't talked about it due to the prevailing
Mm.
political winds and their own situation and power and things like that. I suspect that there are more people on the left in government who are aware of the role that Bitcoin can play and the things that they care about, like economic justice and racial justice and things like that, that haven't been open about it yet because of
Mhm.
the sort of prevailing political winds. Um, I also suspect that there are some people who are motivated not to have that light bulb moment,
Mhm.
either because they've staked their reputation on being anti Bitcoin, or because they are being funded by people who um, Bitcoin harms, like banks, things like that.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't know which camp various people fall into. There also might just be people that are kind of too old and set in their ways to understand how a money could not be printed and distributed by a government, and they
Mhm.
just might not even understand what Bitcoin is and how it's different. I suspect that's true on both sides of the aisle because,
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
Congress is very old. So yeah,
Yeah.
when it comes to someone like Elizabeth Warren, for example, I go back and forth on which category I think she belongs in. Um, I have a lot of Elizabeth Warren merchandise. I voted for her in the 2020 primary, and I was really disappointed. And I thought at first maybe this was just a case of her, the first thing that she heard being anti-Bitcoin, and then just that kind of
Mhm.
setting the window. Right? I teach critical thinking. I know how these anchoring and initial impressions can work, and how they set the standard for the views that are even permissible to have after that. So then I thought, well, maybe as more Democrats and progressives are talking about Bitcoin and explaining what they see, what role they see Bitcoin playing in bringing about the policies that Elizabeth Warren claims to support and the goals that she wants to achieve, then she'll come to understand. And I offered to do that myself. She hasn't taken me up on the offer yet, and I'm
Mhm.
increasingly thinking that either she just can't understand it, or that she's motivated not to understand it. And I'm sure there
Mhm.
are a large number of other people on both sides of the aisle who are in that position as well. So, as to the sort of prevailing winds of change among progressives and liberals and Democrats and people on the left with respect to Bitcoin, I am optimistic that that can change. Um, I think that the work that people like Troy Cross and Marco Paez and others are doing in the mining space and talking about Bitcoin as a way of combating climate change, not just not contributing to it, but actually undoing and mitigating it. Daniel Batten is another one. I think that's the main locus of debate right now between people on the left with respect to Bitcoin. And if that can be overcome, then I think the financial inclusion and justice things are very easy to sell.
Yeah.
So that's why the book went from having one chapter on security through energy to two, because we think that's really important to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's one of the easiest ones to taking something very tangible that's happening that's important for Bitcoin, like Bitcoin mining, explaining it to people. And then Daniel, especially, I mean, Troy and Margo have been doing it for so long, but I think Daniel started ramping it up even more the past year in terms of just daily putting out content and articles and research that says, okay, yes, Bitcoin mining can help expand renewables, but let's focus on like methane mitigation. And here's exactly how this could work and what it would look like, giving very tangible things about one thing in particular. Methane's just there's so many other options here, but he even put out something recently, it was today or yesterday, and I forget what nation in Europe was going after carbon capture technology, which again is mainly just an expense to the business or an expense to taxation or something like that for a state to actually pay for this, and saying, okay, instead of carbon capture, you could also do, methane mitigation with Bitcoin mining and actually get better results, and it would be financially incentivized. So greed could incentivize this. And I think that for me is one of the biggest disconnects, I think, between the left and Bitcoin as well, is just understanding that so many of the things we want, like better results for climate, as I truly believe we do need to address climate change. Like as a progressive, that's one of the things I'm most passionate about. But I came to a realization, especially through Bitcoin, we're not going to do it through just do the right thing. I think I'm a bit more pessimistic in that realm. We need market incentives to actually get businesses and players to actually buy into this to have any meaningful change. And Bitcoin mining is a way to do that. So I think explaining that to people on the left, having the patience to do that and get through some of the political rhetoric is super important. So I agree. I think it's one of the most important things for the left to hear.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated. There are lots of moving parts with respect to energy grids and sources of energy and intermittencies of renewable energy and Bitcoin mining hardware and all these sorts of things. So there's a lot. It's hard to get a handle on how all these things fit together and what the ultimate story is. And the alternative story is very easy, which is Bitcoin consumes as much electricity as, and then insert a country. Or each Bitcoin transaction is equivalent to this much of a household's electricity use. And the sound bites are just so much better that way. And the people who believe that Bitcoin is actually helping with climate change and can help more have to sit down and bring in numbers and data and explain how energy grids work and explain what happens to methane on oil fields and explain how energy is transported. And it's just a much longer story. You can't say it in a tweet or two tweets or probably even a tweet thread. So, while I'm optimistic that the truth is on the side of Bitcoin, I think that getting people to see it is really difficult.
Yeah. And I think too, what I feel too is folks in the community that champion Bitcoin, the one thing I think folks have started to do a better job with since I've been in the space, but doing a better job at not making it solely about Bitcoin, making it about what does Bitcoin address? Because some people are like, oh, they just love this Bitcoin thing. It's like a religion to them, right? I've heard that many times. I had to, I've talked with my wife for so long about this in terms of like the benefits of it, and she's kind of over time started to understand why I get so passionate about it, because she understands what I was passionate about and still am before Bitcoin and how I've connected that. So it's not like, oh, I was passionate about this, now I'm passionate about Bitcoin. It's like I'm passionate about that. That's why I'm passionate about Bitcoin. Like I'm passionate about finding solutions to address some practical things with greenhouse gas emissions. Well, Bitcoin can do that. Like some issues of inequality, maybe we can start to talk about how Bitcoin addresses that. And I think that's something that we can do a better job about, is like, the mantras of Bitcoin will fix everything, that only goes so far. Like you said, it kind of on the opposite end, that's good for a tweet, that's good
Mhm.
for a little thread, but for people that don't know anything about what we're talking about, as they're not going to without exploring more, some of these practical things, those are the light bulb moments of like, oh, we need hooks to pull people in to understand more. But one thing I wanted to ask as well before it leaves my mind is these, passionate arguments, all of these easily digestible misinformation things. You coming from a, philosophy teacher approaching these things, thinking about critical thinking, social media, all of these dynamics, how can we approach people in terms of critical thinking? Because it requires critical thinking, and critical thinking, even with myself, it's really easy to get impassionate and just run down something. I have to make a conscious effort to take a step back, to address my preconceived notions and to try to think critically. It's not the first step in our brain usually. So how do you approach that with, like, how do we think critically? I guess is one question for, for the next 12-hour conversation we do. But in terms of this specifically, what are some things we can help address people in, like, thinking critically about issues? Because that's something that's been very challenging.
I'm not um, that we can.
Yeah, and that's an answer too.
I
Yeah.
think here's what I think. I think we can teach people to think critically, but we can't, as Bitcoiners, teach people to think critically. Because the second that we invoke critical thinking in service of Bitcoin, people are going to be suspicious. Um,
Mhm.
and if you say, "Well, here's how we need to evaluate the evidence," they're thinking, "You're just telling me that because this way of evaluating the evidence supports Bitcoin, and this other way
Right,
doesn't."
right.
And
Mhm.
so I think we need to teach people general critical thinking skills, completely separate from Bitcoin or politics or whatever. We need to teach them how our minds work, the shortcuts that we take, the ways that we tend to go wrong when we're evaluating, collecting evidence, and giving arguments and considering arguments. And then, if they're good at that, then they'll maybe recognize the specific errors that they're making when they're thinking about Bitcoin. Um,
Mhm.
so I talked earlier about the um, people who the first thing they hear about Bitcoin is, how bad it is for the environment. Um, we know from many psychological studies that our brains weight, or our minds weight, the evidence that we get first more heavily than the evidence
Mhm.
that we get later. So, for example, you can give people a list of attributes of a person and ask what they think of the person. And the order that the attributes are listed on this piece of paper will affect how, like, good of a person they think it is. So if you start with the
Mhm.
negative ones and then get better and better, they rate the person as a worse person than if you start with the positive ones. And go.
Hmm.
You can show them two videos: one of a person, helping a child to learn to ride a bike, and then of the other of the person like hitting someone. And if they see the bike riding first, they'll be like, "Oh, he probably hit that person because they tried to harm his child or something." But if they see him in
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
opposite order, it's like, well, of course he's teaching the kid to ride the bike. He doesn't want to have to be responsible for the kid. He's obviously a terrible person because he hit them. So we just know
Right.
that the evidence that we get first, we weight more heavily. I'm not sure that in the context of Bitcoin, we can say to people, "Now, I know you've probably heard a lot of bad things about Bitcoin, but just because you heard it first doesn't mean it's more likely to be right. Let me now give you some other things." They're
Right,
just
right, right.
not going to be able to learn like that. So I'm not I'm not very sanguine on the prospect of trying to teach these things simultaneously. But I do think more people should take critical thinking classes, so
Mhm.
that they can learn just how many times they're making these kinds of cognitive reasoning mistakes.
Yeah, and at least for me personally, like, I don't really like being told what to do, as trivial as that sounds. I grew up I've mentioned this a few times, and I know you've taught classes, I believe, on like philosophy of religion and things like this. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical environment, and since then, have really been turned off by evangelizing by things that I've seen similar communities. It's not just Bitcoin, but so many different that replicate from religion. And for me personally, preaching about Bitcoin and using that word specifically, I don't think is the most effective tool, right? It's kind of like presenting resources, people doing better about what you mentioned with Troy and so many others, just putting out data, putting out facts, kind of settling there, having it become more and more a norm to dispute things, and then having people realize this or access it themselves and things like that, I think is way better. That's how I came to Bitcoin. In general, it was just kind of learning for yourself. And I think folks need to do a better job also of trusting that people can and will do that rather than saying you won't. So I'm gonna teach you about this in this way. Like you need to listen. That's an immediate turnoff as well. And there's got to be different studies around that as well and the effects of that. Maybe
Mhm.
it works for some people, but I don't think it would be the most effective tool. And I think we're still doing a lot of that in terms of Bitcoin.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we can do that helps is tell stories and
Mm,
tell other people's stories, or um,
yep.
elevate the voices of people who are telling their stories. So
Hmm.
people in Ukraine who received aid in Bitcoin, people in Hong Kong who use Bitcoin to buy things to protest the government, people who live in Turkey or Argentina with really high inflation who are using Bitcoin. Um, I can like mention them now, but that's not going to move
Hmm.
people as much as hearing them tell their story of how Bitcoin is
Yeah.
helping them. And the more of those stories you hear, the more difficult it is to have this tech bro reaction, or to have this, oh
Yeah.
yeah, but climate change and Bitcoin mining uses so much electricity. We know that some electricity use is worth it. So the question we need to
Hmm.
ask then is this kind of electricity use worth it? Well, maybe it's not for the vast majority of the Bitcoin stories we hear, which is relatively wealthy um, white people in America who have it as a backup currency, a
Hmm.
store of
Hmm.
value, things like that. Um, I
Yeah.
personally don't really care about that. Most of those people would have been just fine without Bitcoin. They wouldn't be as wealthy, but they wouldn't be in trouble. I care about
Hmm.
the people who would be in big trouble without Bitcoin, struggling to survive or maybe not survive.
Yeah.
Those are the stories that motivate me to, work on Bitcoin and to try to convince people that it's a good thing.
Yeah. Same. And I go back and forth all the time. Sometimes I get so frustrated with that first narrative or the middle narrative you mentioned of, you know, let's say folks in the US, middle class, upper class folks. And I'm like, listen, I'm just going to stop focusing on that or trying to convince you all or this group and just try to amplify stories and have conversations with those folks you just mentioned. Because without those stories or without those use cases, yeah, we have PayPal, we have all these other things. And again, then you understand underlying fundamental tech and you see the potential problems with that could happen. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow in the US, but those conversations I think make Bitcoin worth it. Like, why was this experiment created in the first place? Why are we focusing on this? And for me, those use cases are enough to say, yeah, we should advocate for this and kind of see this out because that is worth it enough. I don't think the people that say, well, we need more use cases or it needs to accomplish these 3 million things, I don't think they're being genuine in that because one of those stories you mentioned, I think is enough to say, let's at least just like leave it alone or try to have it flourish or let's even support it or advocate for it. Whatever. I think you're exactly right. More and more people share those stories and are moved by those stories. And that makes a lot of sense. That's what a Bitcoin is for. Anyone, everyone. I've started to like the term Bitcoin is for anyone a little bit better recently. Um, but Bitcoin is also for those people. That's what brought me into it. Is seeing it as it's for the 99%. It's for this global population that have been decimated by their financial structures and things like that. And I think once people hear that argument, again, just using my wife as a reference, once I told her about like Farida's story in Togo and these activists, it was like, oh yeah, like why aren't we doing more to support this? I'm like, I don't know. I do know, but I don't know at the same
Yeah,
time.
I mean the first story that I remember hearing was the story of Roya and starting this company
Mhm.
and hearing about people that were working for her that as soon as they get paid, would have to turn over all their money to their husbands, and they had no financial freedom or independence on their own. And
Yeah.
so she started paying them in Bitcoin, largely because they could hide it and they wouldn't have to tell anyone
Hmm.
about it. So financial privacy is really important for a lot of people. Anyone who wants to monetarily interact in ways that their families, governments, corporations, whatever, don't like, is at risk if you have a technology that's not private. And so I think because of how Bitcoin started with cypherpunk message boards, and because of the number of libertarian leaning people, the stories that people tend to think about when they think about Bitcoin is like, oh yeah, that's what you use, and Silk Road, that's what you use to buy drugs
Hmm. Hmm.
or assassins or guns, and we don't like those things, so Bitcoin is bad. And it doesn't take much of a imagination to think about other countries and rules that they have that you might think people are at least permitted to break, if not obligated to break.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not then hard to think about other states and rules that they might be currently enacting or have enacted in the
Hmm.
past, um, about, say, reproductive health care or
Yep.
about marijuana, and think, yeah, maybe there's a reason that we had things like cash, and maybe it's good for that to exist digitally so that people can
Hmm.
get the healthcare that they need, or can get the anxiety medication that they need. And yeah, so elevating more of those stories, I think, is just huge.
Yeah. Margot and I touched on that when her and I spoke recently, but that's a grave concern for me because of the actions. Like, let's say, and I'll be specific here. I'll use an example. There are many. I think it can be used in totalitarian ways on both sides. But for me personally, again, as a progressive, I'll make no ifs, ands, and buts about this. I think, let's say, someone like Ron DeSantis and the policies that he's tried to enact in Florida. Let's say this person hypothetically became president and wanted to enact some of these things a bit more federally, or other states were supportive of him as leader. So Texas and Alabama and whoever else, just mentioning random states here as an example, wanted to say, okay, Planned Parenthood cannot function in certain areas of our state or other areas. Banks will kind of hear this, and sort of there might be some petition, but they can be crafty politically with ways they say and suggest it's not as bad as people are saying, and this and that. Planned Parenthood could have banking access cut off in a particular state. And those services, let's say they're interrupted even for a few months until Congress passes something. But let's say they don't, and it's just inoperable in certain states, right? Just some basic tenets. Like, that is not something that's a far stretch for me as a progressive that I try to tell progressive friends about, saying, if there were different, better ways to support these organizations so they didn't have to rely on banks that have state licenses and then federal licenses, if they could raise and support Bitcoin, and if we had what I would say is more supportive legislation to where people could actually spend and use and hold Bitcoin in even more supportive ways. These are things that could happen in the US. And I think there are more deadly ramifications in other places, like you're mentioning, whether we're talking about like Afghanistan, whether we're talking about Togo and other places. But there's different ways where it's not too far of a stretch to think about what that can mean in the US. If something is used against your enemy, it can be used against you. And Ian Gaines and I, by the time our conversation comes out, his will be out, talked a lot about this in terms of technology and freedom tech. It's top of mind for me as a
Mhm.
progressive.
Yeah, you imagine someone who lives in Austin and gets pregnant, is really looking forward to having a baby. At 26 weeks, finds out that the baby's organs are growing outside of its body, and it's probably going to die in the womb, and definitely not going to survive outside of the womb for longer than a few hours. But Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas and Oklahoma have all outlawed abortion. And so it's, a 14-hour drive to Albuquerque. And when you get
Mhm.
back, Texas also has laws that um, incentivize people to report you if they think that you've had an abortion,
Mhm.
and they'll get some sort of financial reward for it. So you can imagine someone in that position thinking, um, I'm in trouble. What am I going
Yeah.
to do? How do I pay for this? How do I arrange this kind of thing? So having some sort of messaging system that doesn't store records, and then having some sort of payment technology that is private and censorship resistant seems really important.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so
And this is a case where even with Bitcoin, there could still be very challenges to this. The government can still use, metaphorically, this physical force, right? In terms of whether it's taxation, in terms of whether it's prison time, but there are many tools within Bitcoin that utilize Bitcoin and utilize other privacy tech that can make it more private. Like Bitcoin on the surface doesn't necessarily do that. That's why it's kind of like okay, Bitcoin is the start of other conversations about other types of freedom tech that use Bitcoin. That's a perfect example right there. Yeah. And what's so frustrating is folks on the left, I think, care a lot about that, but I haven't seen that connection yet. And I'm really hoping that connection will be made as well. Like so many different activist groups. Um, I had been trying to do research the past year or so just on seeing if there were any LGBTQ trans communities that were thinking through some of these problems in terms of protesting, raising support, things like this. And I actually saw, I think I mentioned this in one other conversation. It might have been with Margot, about some cryptocurrency that was targeted at like, okay, this is the currency for the gay community, right? But it was a crypto that can be rugged. It was a private company. It was all of these things, and it's like, no, you're missing the point. Like, use Bitcoin. Like, use Bitcoin in these instances to crowdfund, to source. But they were creating other crypto projects, trying to get at what we're articulating, because Bitcoin for them has been labeled as it's the right wing currency. And mainstream media has really supported that. A little bit less and less, but really ramped it up during COVID time. And I think there were some famous players in the space that really talked about how they held and used Bitcoin. So mainstream media ran with that as well, which is unfortunate. And I think we're still trying to get over that a
I
little
know
bit.
that Nick Dobrow at one point was talking to women's shelters about sending women out with
Mm,
Bitcoin so that they could more easily transact in ways that their people who've been victims of domestic violence or something wouldn't expose their credit cards if that might be
mhm.
something that their former partner had access to or things like that. It would be you could just be more
Yeah.
confident that when they were buying things, it wasn't being tracked, they weren't being spied on. Um, the person wasn't going to end up showing up having found out where they live or something. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's
I mean,
use
it's,
cases all over the place for the kinds of
yeah.
things
And
that
we,
progressives claim to care about, and so either they don't know about them, and we need to do a better job of not just talking about Bitcoin as a store of value and digital gold and all this stuff, but Bitcoin as a way of enacting these kinds of things, or they know about it and they don't think the trade off is worth it. And so
mhm,
we can I think talk about this on two fronts. One is why isn't it worth it? What are the trade offs that you think are bad? It's probably the energy stuff. And then we can
mhm,
say, um, look at how many people could potentially use this. And the more people that are using it, the more private it becomes. The more
mhm,
you're part of a vast network of people. So you can try to hide in a crowd of 20, much easier to hide in a crowd of 100,000. So the more people that have Bitcoin and are transacting with it, are using Lightning, are on the blockchain, um, the harder it is for, say, authoritarian governments to pick out one particular person's transactions. And
mm.
so the more privacy everyone gets. We call this privacy by obscurity in the book.
Yeah, yeah. And the more people get into it as well, again, going back to that Trojan horse analogy, the financial incentive for companies to create products, whether it's apps, whether it's Lightning and other apps for actually using Bitcoin that increase privacy layers. Like, there's then a market demand. Like, people will be more likely to create products that cater to that. In addition, adding more and more security to it. So it's all of these things that go through that. But how one thing that I think progressives have been using. I know it's a whole other conversation that I don't typically get into because it's just so frivolous, but Greenpeace and others. So now what we're seeing, um, we don't know when, but obviously a lot of institutions, a lot of big banks, a lot of ETFs and market makers and all these things are, kind of flipping the script on Bitcoin and saying, okay, we're for Bitcoin. They're seeing ways they can make money on it, obviously as a product, and so they're all in. Makes sense just from that practical angle. I think a lot of progressives, one thing I could see that the Greenpeace has already tried is that, okay, big banks and these kind of corporations are all in on Bitcoin. Those people screw over the little guy or fight against the little guy. And obviously, someone holding or utilizing Bitcoin does not do anything to affect someone else for wanting to use Bitcoin in a different way. So, how do you think through that? Do you think that is just a messaging, an unfortunate messaging event? Do you think that this will actually make it harder for Bitcoin to be used in the way that it should be used because people might be more likely to just have it in the ETF, or it might be difficult? It's kind of a way for the government to have better tabs on Bitcoin and price movement and all of these things. Have you put much thought into that?
Yes. Um, Ultimately, I think it's probably a good thing. Uh, what I would like is for all of the people who really need Bitcoin to get Bitcoin, and then for these ETFs to be approved, and the price of Bitcoin goes up, and all the people who really need it the most have gotten in first.
Mm.
So one of the ways that Greenpeace is maybe trying to taint Bitcoin is this idea that because these companies are into it, it's either already bad, and that's why they're into it, or they're going to make it bad. And
Mhm.
I don't think that either of those work. I think we can combat the first one by just telling all these stories. And then the second one, I think we can just explain how Bitcoin works and the fact that these people have no control over the Bitcoin protocol. They have no control over the distribution of Bitcoin. They have no control unless they, start doing things like mining. And so this is one area where I do start to get concerned, is um, if there becomes a sufficiently large mining pool that can start to do things like censor transactions, block certain kinds of coins from being um, transacted, things like that.
Mhm.
That's a concern. That has always been a concern. I think it will always be a concern.
Mhm.
That Bitcoin is subject to this kind of capture. Um, so we talk about this in chapter 11 of the book, where we consider all these objections against Bitcoin. One of them is that at present, it's not prohibitively expensive to run that kind of, I consider it an attack on the Bitcoin network.
Mhm.
Um, but if that doesn't happen, I think that these ETFs and things like that make the price go up. It is unfortunate that people who might otherwise have acquired Bitcoin and custodied it themselves and things like that are going to just have ETFs instead. But for the vast majority of people who buy the ETFs, they wouldn't have bought Bitcoin at all. And so I don't
Mhm.
think it removes any of the privacy or censorship or inclusion aspects of Bitcoin from anyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, while you were talking, it might have been Troy in an episode of Peter's podcast, What Bitcoin Did, mentioning that, and I don't know how much you think about this too, or if this ship has sailed, the potential of the White House under any administration or, Fed in any regard, leaning on Bitcoin miners or some of these pools. Let's say the attack doesn't even happen in that vector, but then government comes in and says, we need you to start censoring XYZ transactions. Or obviously there's different, okay, transactions from North Korea. And for me, my argument is typically just do better police work. Like don't, change a whole protocol or try to just censor arbitrarily, which has been our status quo since 2001, quite frankly, in our country. Like, do better police work. You can, if you're doing good police work, you can see if someone's using Bitcoin for illegal and illicit, like arms smuggling, terrorism, things like that, easier than you can cash, quite frankly. You're just not doing it. You'd rather take the lazier approach, to be honest. For you, is that alongside that attack vector? Is that something, I know companies can say, oh, we won't do that, this and that. But, at the end of the day, depending on where you're at, That's why I think global mining options are really important as well. Um, what do you think about that in terms of any realistic option, or do you think that ship is kind of sailing?
I get so it would take something like a constantly updating list of blocked addresses, maybe that
Hmm.
U.S. based companies just couldn't allow on the blockchain. So then the idea would be, if you're mining in another country and you know that the list is out there, you have access to the list, you can choose to use it or not. But you know that a US based company won't build on top of blocks that you create. They'll only build on top of blocks that they create or that don't have these addresses in them. Then you start to get worried about whether you're going to end up mining a bunch of orphaned blocks. And that becomes it becomes cost prohibitive to you. So yeah, I take that as a serious a serious concern as well.
Hmm.
What I think we would see is the majority of hash rate not be in the US. And these US
Hmm.
companies who are trying to um, mine complying with these rules, um, their blocks would still be valid according to the rest of the world. So they could still continue to exist, continue to run profitably. Um, but I would think that anyone who had a choice about where to mine would not want to be mining in the US if that's what
Hmm.
happened.
Yeah, so a bit of the game theory playing
Yeah,
out
I
more.
think so.
Yeah, I would my I think rational brain thinks that because we've seen that, right? There's a lot of the argument that why haven't they squashed it already a while ago? So we'll see with that. But one other thing I want to make sure to cover with you in terms of talking inside baseball on progressive politics. So in Congress there's the Progressive Caucus, which I would say a lot of the conversation we've had in terms of different value sets and things like this. I would say we probably agree with and align with in terms of this value set. But the one thing I would veer from with the Progressive Caucus are a lot of progressives who are fighting for legislation in the United States, almost across the board. Once I got into Bitcoin, I started to learn more and more about the history of money, budget deficits, U.S. budget deficits, things that Republicans kind of talk a lot about, but they only talk about it when their candidate isn't in office. It's a political game. It's not actually on this is the theory I believe in. And this is it, not even in regard to like Keynesian or Austrian economics. It's more like our nation is massively in debt. We're constantly facing crises and banking crises that happened even earlier this year, end of last year, that can be more quickly covered up at alarming rates compared to 2008. Those things I think will just continue to happen and are being far too normalized that affect everyday people and will continue affecting everyday people. I would say what concerns me is the progressive caucus or progressive politicians would say, okay, the budget deficit, like people that argue against that or say we shouldn't keep spending, or that's kind of a monetary theory. I've heard some people say that argument is, oh, it's actually racist. It actually affects other folks if we say, okay, we can't keep racking up budget deficit. And I think there's a lot of people that truly believe that and have the best of intentions about wanting to pass really progressive policies and get money down to the people who need it most in healthcare and all of these other things, but don't understand that this budget deficit, these Fed policies, this history of money, all of these things really, really matter. And we're probably not going to be able to address some of these things in that same way without looking at that first. Like progressives don't seem to understand that. At least progressive politicians that are trying to make some of these decisions. And I'm not sure if it's an education gap. I'm not sure if it's just, well, these are the cards we're dealt. We have to do the best with what we can. And I'm not advocating for, okay, let's switch to hard money tomorrow and just let it crash and then we'll rebuild, right? That would be awful. A lot of death, a lot of destruction, quite literally. So it's not even that. How do you think through that as well? Because I think the left and money, it's just a complicated, messy thing that I would like for folks to start seeing in a different way, I think.
The first thing,
There's a lot in there. It
yeah.
should that's something I think about a lot. I'm like, I don't know how to address this. And sorry, I'll add one more thing. Even for me personally, I am. In terms of, big government budgets, this and that, like, listen, my thought is like, I agree with you. I think healthcare should be a right. I think there are a lot of things we should be spending a lot of money on in this nation as a country that accepts taxes, that is in the year 2023 with a population of 350 million, that is not returning to a feudal era. So there are some things that I believe in taxation for and believe that we should be spending money on as a progressive that advocates for certain policies from legislation with taxpayer dollars. So I'm not saying we should get rid of government funding for a lot of things. I think we should increase it for some things. But it's very complicated with money, and we can't just do that without looking at other areas, in my opinion.
The first thing, so I think there's two separate things here. One is, how does all that stuff that you just said relate to Bitcoin? And then the second is, what do I think of all that stuff? So I'll do the Bitcoin one first because I think it's easier. I don't ever see, maybe not ever. I would be shocked in my lifetime if the U.S. dollar were to fail. I think the U.S. will continue to use the U.S. dollar, and it's very unlikely that we'll adopt Bitcoin. I do think it's really important that Bitcoin exist alongside the U.S. dollar. One, as a competitive check against the policies and institutions that deal with the U.S. dollar. So, for example, and already in the privacy domain, we see U.S. talking about a central bank digital currency. The fact that Bitcoin exists as a digital currency with certain kinds of privacy guarantees makes it more likely that the eventual US CBDC will come with some sort of privacy guarantees because there's an alternative people can go to. And I think that's the same thing for Bitcoin's monetary policy. The fact that Bitcoin exists and has a set in stone monetary policy serves as a competitive check against US monetary policy. There is somewhere else that people can go. They can exchange their dollars for Bitcoin relatively easily if they get too concerned about the US's monetary policy.
Or at least from corporate interest, right? Like if they say, I don't want to support JP Morgan Chase and have my money sitting there and losing value in a savings account, I'll save some of that in Bitcoin, right? So at least start with the corporate, from a progressive mindset. That's an easy argument there too.
Yeah, that too, for sure. So then what do I think of ways that progressives have advocated for, especially social policies that cost a lot of money? I think that one problem has been that they've proposed a tax increase and they've proposed spending that tax money on things like healthcare, and they're not getting the tax increase that they want. And so when they succeed in the spending part, but they don't succeed in the paying for it part, then we end up printing more money. I'm not sure that they acknowledge the potential problems with excess money printing. You might have thought that we would have learned a lesson from inflation in the last couple of years as a result of, it seems, to pretty much everyone, excess money printing. They may have learned that lesson. I'm not sure.
Well, I'll pause there because at least in speeches made, this has been a point from most in the West that are left-leaning leaderships, whether it's Canada, in much of Europe compared to like the U.S. context of what we think of, at least moderate left, that kind of thing. In the US, a lot of it has not been said, oh, it's because we're printing money. Like they're not outright saying that. And again, inflation is a whole nother very complicated case. There's people that argue that is one of the sole reasons. There's many people that argue that's one of 5 reasons. There's varying degrees of what you can make reasonable arguments about how much that contributes. But the fact is that it is making somewhat of an effect. I think that's undisputable, as you mentioned. But a lot of folks are mentioning other things. I think corporate greed is bad. I don't think corporate greed is good, but I don't think that is one of the leading causes of inflation over a couple of year period. You have months here and there, but so there are folks that are just not saying that at all. And many of my friends and many people on the left don't know that at all. Like money printing as a concept, would not even understand where to begin.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe it's my own particular bubbles of progressives that I talk to that are that pretty directly connect the stimulus checks with inflation, but also think
Yeah, maybe I need smarter friends too. I'm just kidding.
They also
They're
think,
great.
as
them.
I do, like the stimulus checks were a good thing, and this pandemic might have been a complete disaster on some sort of hard money standard.
I agree with that as a progressive Bitcoiner. And again, we can say we as a society agree to pay for things like that, and maybe don't agree to pay for other things or corporate bailouts or all of these other nonsense things.
So I think when it comes to the things that the progressive caucus want to use money to pay for, I agree by and large. Things like healthcare, and they want to pay for it by not spending so much money in the defense budget and by taxing billionaires at a much greater rate. And I agree with those two things too.
Yeah. I agree with that too. The one thing I have not seen come to fruition, as you mentioned, is at the end of the day, because they go through this committee and that committee and that committee, and then by the end, those tax increases didn't happen, and then they try to package it onto some emergency measure. And that's where the conspiracy theories come into play. And again, it's tougher and tougher for me to argue it, for me to say, hey, Democrats, or hey, whatever, wake up. Look how people are connecting the dots and making, I think, kind of wild conspiracy claims about, oh, they're only going to sneak this in. They're going to create emergencies in the future to fund these things. It's like, give me a reason to prove them wrong, because that seems to be the only time that you all are actually trying to pass legislation to bring about these initiatives or whatever. And they, quite frankly, are not interested at all in talking about the deficit, because it is a very abstract thing for people, but it's been affecting us year after year after year after year for a long time. Since the 90s or whatever, it's really been ramping up since then. So yeah, I agree with you, and I think these conversations are a bit too nuanced as well. Or it's nuanced that we should be having more in Bitcoin. Is like, there are many progressive Bitcoiners that would say, yes, we do want to spend money and taxation on certain things. But I'm also saying, from the left, you cannot completely disregard money printing and the effect that it has on poor people in the country through inflation and ramping up inequality. That's 100% true. In terms of progressives, for folks listening, I know a few, but you mentioned some. I believe you were one of the speakers at the Bitcoin Policy Institute event in DC. That remind me when that event was. Like, was that this summer? My time frame is all over the place. Okay, it was before that. Yep. And I know I heard from many folks how great of an event that was, and I think a lot of those videos are up as well for folks to find through Bitcoin Policy Institute's YouTube and Twitter, things like that. Some of the progressives that you would say are kind of open to these conversations that we're talking about. I think there are a lot that are open to crypto, blockchain, things like that, and including Bitcoin. Do you have any folks that you would recommend, or kind of in general, what have some of those conversations been like for you? Interfacing with some of these folks, interfacing with other folks that are doing work in DC. What are some of the things you're hearing from progressives that are open to Bitcoin?
That the human rights angle is everything. That if there's to be any hope of onboarding more, or bringing on board, onboarding sounds way too much like a platform or something. Bringing on board to being pro Bitcoin, more democratic representatives, the human rights story has to be front and center. So people like Alex Gladstein at Human Rights Foundation, and Roya, and I'm blanking on who else. Charlene, I think, was in that panel. And so,
yeah, I think she was. I remember seeing a video.
So both, and I think Ian talked about it nationally. So the international and the national story both need to be told. How Bitcoin is empowering historically marginalized groups of people in the U.S., and how Bitcoin is helping people in other countries to get the things that they need or deserve. That's pretty much the only hope that we have for progressives. And I mean, thankfully, there's a lot of these stories, and it's not hard to tell. You just have to get them to listen. And the way to get them
Yeah.
to listen is to have more people, typically younger, who would call them up and say, I disagree with your Bitcoin position. Have you heard about this story? And, just like they all have voicemails or they all have people like tell some stories. Call up your
Yeah.
representatives or call up the people in Congress that you like and that you agree with and tell them, I agree with you about almost everything, but I'm really disappointed that you haven't said anything about Bitcoin, or I'm really disappointed that you've
Hmm.
signed up on this anti-crypto thing, and explain why.
Yeah.
There's reasons for optimism, I think, among especially the non big name people. So a lot of the big
Yeah.
names have their reputations now staked on one side or the other.
Hmm.
But the people who don't have that, a lot of them, represent a younger constituency. Democrats, by and large, are younger than
Hmm.
Republicans. Democratic voters are younger than Republican voters, and they have more Bitcoin than the older
Yeah.
people. So, if you have Bitcoin and you care about Bitcoin and you want pro Bitcoin attitudes to be represented in Congress, then you have to somehow make that known.
Yeah. I think that's a great, like, more ending message here. One other thing I wanted to mention and ask, because there's so many things that I think Bitcoin can start to address and fix, but some things that not. Are there, when you're thinking about kind of, we talked a lot about Congress and Senate, are there certain tenets or values that you hold when thinking about leadership in Congress? Like a lot of people, Ro Khan actually put out a good list recently that I was like, I agree with, in terms of very practical solutions of term limits. Because you talk about, I think one of the issues with Democrats in Congress is you mentioned all these younger voters, and there's a lot of younger leaders or younger people that are being elected into the House and other areas that I think they'd be, at least be open to it. They're not going to be just staunchly against it for whatever arbitrary reason because their opponent likes it or something like that. But are there certain beliefs that you hold in terms of power and leadership uh, in Congress, in government, that if we voted on, would actually be beneficial? Things like term limits, things about like money and finance, things like that. Are there certain things that you see as really positive that could be implemented to rein in some of the power and checks that Bitcoin just can't do? Right? We could say, okay, we have the most pro Bitcoin, but we still have these leaders that are in there for 70 years and are not there and are still in office. Certain things that you kind of hold to. I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Um, During the campaign, Donald Trump pledged to end the revolving door of people who worked in the White House or in Congress and then worked in lobbying positions or for
Mhm.
companies that were asking for money for the federal government, contractors and things like that. And if I recall correctly, he did absolutely nothing about that. But I think that's a huge one, is ending,
Mhm.
making some sort of limit on how long after you work for the White House you can work for, make some list of lobbying organizations and um, companies, and vice versa. You can't go straight from ExxonMobil to the White House or to Congress or something like that.
Yeah.
And limits on congressional trading, I think, are a really big one. A lot of people in Congress profit off the insider knowledge that they have about what's happening
Mhm.
in the country. And so I think something like a ban on trading individual stocks is completely reasonable.
Yep.
Um, some sort of campaign finance reform, these
Mm.
501c4s that can operate without basically disclosing anything at all. Um, I think that so much money is spent on elections that could be spent on something else. So I'd almost favor some sort of public funding of campaigns and
Mhm.
capping how much can be spent. Um, and yeah, I think those would go a long way towards
Yeah,
solving
if
the
we
kinds
start
of
there.
problems that we
Yeah.
see financially with members of Congress
Yeah.
and having sort of the wrong incentives to be in Congress.
Yeah. And the reason I ask that too is because a lot of Bitcoiners can know and get really passionate about Bitcoin. But I also think as Bitcoiners, one of the reasons it exists, the things we're passionate about, is also a check on power and giving more power to local communities and people and need it. So I think it's important for Bitcoiners to educate themselves a little bit about what are some other things outside of Bitcoin that might go a long way. That I think those things you mentioned are great. And we've actually seen bipartisan agreement on some of those. I think like AOC and Matt Gaetz have talked about stock trading. Like those things are not necessarily, I think they are progressive in a lot of ways, but they're just, it makes sense for like what government should and should not be doing. So I think there could be more Bitcoiners on the flip side, non-Bitcoiners getting into Bitcoin, but Bitcoiners understanding, okay, this would go a long way alongside something like Bitcoin to put a check on power. Some of these basic things that, some Bitcoiners might not listen to this episode because they're turned off by politics, and that's, hey, totally understand. But I would encourage some folks, if you care about these things, these values we're talking about in Bitcoin, it's also good to look into politics and see these practical checks on power that I think will go a long way. So I'm actually optimistic that some of those things will happen. Hoping in the next year or two,
Yeah,
we'll see.
I'm
We'll
optimistic
see.
too, but
It's been talked about for a long time. But
there's also this interesting question. I wonder where you come down on this, because I've seen a lot of Twitter discourse around this idea of like a one issue Bitcoin voter, and I think
I hate it.
Well,
not to cut you off.
So
my
good. So I started
anyway.
off hating it more than I currently hate it. So I started off thinking, no, there are so many things that are way more important than someone's stance on Bitcoin. And it's like their stance on healthcare and their stance on public education and all these kinds of things. And then the more that I thought about it, the more that I think, well, the story that I just told about someone who's living in Texas and is going to die without an abortion, and they can't get the abortion in Texas. I think Bitcoin helps solve that problem. So then I started to think, I wonder how much of the things that I think are more important than Bitcoin are actually somehow related to Bitcoin, such that if the person, the problems wouldn't arise as much if there was more Bitcoin adoption. So I still don't like it, and I still think it's impractical, and I still, if I disagreed with someone's position on healthcare, but I agreed with their position on Bitcoin, I don't think I would vote for them. But I wonder how a lot of people don't have to navigate this tension because they already agree with all of the aspects of the politicians that they want to vote for, and Bitcoin's just one of them. But when there's this conflict, how, you have a podcast about Bitcoin, you don't have a podcast about all these other things. Clearly, you think Bitcoin is really important in solving some of these problems. So how do you navigate the internal tension between, say, one candidate that's you agree with about Bitcoin, but not much else, and then another candidate that is perhaps vociferously anti-Bitcoin, but you agree with about some other things?
Yeah, it's hard. It is hard, and I answered very abruptly saying no, and I think my main reason, because I think a lot of people that tout Bitcoin, I don't think it'll actually get implemented the way they're saying, right? Some of these, so it's more of a campaign promise. Yeah, it's not going to happen. If I knew the future and knew that person was going to enact all of these different things that will allow some people to be protected financially, and also not just support Bitcoin, but support like, fully encrypted technology, like private channels, other freedom tech, and not hinder these things that protect people, I'd be less concerned about what they're saying on Twitter or some of their personal politics. If I know people are protected regardless of what their views are or their politics are, that would be great. And I think that's more at a congressional legislation level, so many other things. So if I knew that, I think I'd be along with what you're saying. But yeah, I would probably agree that I was 100% turned off by it. But the more time goes on, the less I see things changing with people that I like historically, the more frustrated and concerned I get that I'm like, they are just missing the boat and we need to drastically change things. Would I then, am I going to vote for someone like Ted Cruz right off the bat? Like, absolutely not. I don't see myself doing that because I think it's been a political tool. I don't know how much could actually be practically put in. Some people have asked me, "Oh, Trey, you're telling me you're not going to vote for a person that is 100% pro Bitcoin, and you're going to vote for your typical candidate?" Yeah, right. Like you're going to vote for the Bitcoin person. I'm like, no, I have values that supersede. People can read into this as they want, but supersede Bitcoin. Values with me that stand regardless of Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is an effective tool. But it is harder and harder for me to say an outright no, absolutely not, or yes, absolutely if someone's touting it. But I think in general it's an interesting marketing tactic. I know Dennis Porter used to use it. I'm not sure if he uses it much anymore. There's many Bitcoiners, and I think Dennis is doing incredible work. But I typically shy away from that and encourage people. It sounds a bit like a religious mantra. I think we need to realize there's a lot of very important things in life, and Bitcoin can be a tool for. But I mean, even you just asking the question is good for people to
Yeah.
think about.
I think it's I think
general
it's
for that.
very unlikely that someone would have Bitcoin as their highest value, because presumably the reason they were
Yeah.
drawn to Bitcoin was because they had other values and they saw how Bitcoin brought
Sure.
about those
Yep.
values. And so, yeah, maybe
Yep.
you just put Bitcoin along with all the rest of the ways to bring about those values, and then see, um, are these candidates going to, on the whole, support more of my values than the other candidate? And Bitcoin will be one of those things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a good thing for people to think about. Bradley, thank you so much for coming on, for doing this conversation. I'm sure we'll do more of these conversations. But just in general, is there a current timeline on the book? I know you guys are working on it, wrapping up things. Really excited to have people be able to get a copy of the book and advertise that for you all, of course, through our podcast and others. Really excited for the book to come out. But if you want to, where people can get updates on the book and progress, and then where people can follow along you as well.
The first draft of the book was sent in. We got back comments from the editor. We responded to those comments, and I've done my part. So we're just waiting on Andrew and Craig to
Yeah, let's throw them under the bus. Come on, Andrew and
to
Craig.
write those parts. But Craig is optimistic about being done by about a week from today, and Andrew hopefully around there as well. So the goal is to have the book submitted back to the publisher by like mid-October, and then
Awesome.
that it would be in printed form available to purchase by mid-January to mid-February. I'm not sure. So we're looking into a bunch of different ways of trying to get this book widely known. I mean, the goal is, so the first line of the book is Bitcoin is for criminals. And the goal is for Elizabeth Warren to hold up this book on the Senate floor and say, see, Bitcoin is for criminals. Because then more people will buy it and they'll read the arguments.
Can I ask, did Andrew come up with that first line, or was this a joint venture? That feels like an Andrew line.
I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, all of you could have written that line.
Yeah.
So let's be fair.
I'm not sure. I could maybe find that out. That'd be interesting. But yeah, I mean, as soon as it was down there, we knew we wanted to start with meeting the reader where they're at. And this is not a book for Bitcoiners. Bitcoiners will learn a lot from it, I hope. But it's the target audience is helping people to understand Bitcoin. The subtitle is A Philosophical Case for Bitcoin. You don't need to give a philosophical case for Bitcoin to people who already accept Bitcoin. So we're trying to meet people where they're at. And so the goal is to try to get it into as many hands as possible who just don't understand Bitcoin or don't understand why people care about it. And to give some arguments that Bitcoin is good for the world. And indeed, that given your values, whoever you are, you should prefer a world with Bitcoin in it to a world without Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's great. And there's so many more new resources and books coming out that make Bitcoin even more inclusive, just in terms of people accessing educational information that they can resonate with. So I'm really, really excited about that. That's incredible. Really looking forward to that. Yeah. Well, thank you so much again. Be sure to tell people where they can find you, follow along if you're, posting articles, tweets, whatever.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at RettlerB, and you can see all of the things that I've written and that Andrew and Craig have written on Bitcoin, or any subgroup thereof. Sometimes I write with Andrew, sometimes Andrew writes with Craig. That's all on Resistance.
How does that make you feel when Andrew writes with Craig and just
Well, sometimes it feels great because they know a lot more about certain things than I do. And I'm glad that I don't have to be involved with the more technical aspects of things. So yeah, all the stuff that we've written is on resistance.money.
Awesome. Cool. So people check that out. We'll throw it in the show notes as well. Bradley, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure talking with you today.